Hi, I'm so pleased to talk to you. It's really an honor to get to talk about some of the things I've been working on in a place like Forum Z. We've all been exploring playful history, from Assassin's Creed to Pentiment and Valiant Hearts and Through the Darkness of Times. Or as one might call it, you've been playing game histories. So I'm a historian by training, Greek and Roman history, and a career history teacher. I've been teaching classes of one sort or another for almost 30 years, and 22 of those years have been at Cincinnati Country Day School, a fantastic independent school in the United States. I'm a quarter of the way through my 24th year as a high school teacher, and perhaps most importantly for this talk, I've written a book on using video games in history classes, Gaming the Past. I also have a website where I've collected 20 or more years of thoughts and experiments and information about historical games and history education. I've been playing video games and board games for more than 40 years. Today, I want to talk to you about history games and their potential to educate informally, but mostly formally in history classes. That phrasing's a bit misleading, however. The games don't educate us. We are, or at least we should never be passive recipients in some process of education that's poured into us. Rather, in the process of playing and critiquing historical video games, student players can learn things about history, about modern media, about representations of the past, about agency and systems, and this is all in the process of critically studying historical games. So if at the end of this talk you're thinking, I'm doing history too in my daily life, or video games about the past could be great in formal education, or wow, history education can be exciting, or gee, there's a lot more going on in the world than I knew about before this talk. If you think those things, then I've had some success. And better still, if you have some questions for me at the end of this talk when we have time, that'll be great. As I like to say to my students, questions imply caring, and I hope you will come to care for this topic that I care about so much. Last thing, for your search convenience, I've put some search terms at the bottom of most of the slides that will get you to the various work I've done and other people have done on these subjects. And though this is a recording, we're going to do it live in front of it because unfortunately I can't record it over and over because my teaching schedule won't allow it. So we're going to hope for the best here, and maybe it'll be flawless, sure. Okay, so the idea of games and learning has been around for a while and even developed into a field of sorts, though that's not my primary area of work. Um, First, when you're thinking about games and learning, it's important to think about what we mean by learning. And learning's not just knowing things, but knowing things in useful and meaningful ways. It's not a new concept, it's at least as old as the ancient world. A couple thousand years ago, the Greek biographer Plutarch said, quote, "For the mind does not require filling like a bottle, but rather like wood, it only requires kindling to create in it an impulse to think independently and an ardent desire for the truth." It's not just knowing concepts and information, right? It's not just having things poured into you, but knowing what one can do with those concepts and information, and being moved to learn more, to know and to be able to do more. Think about how you've learned anything that wasn't required of you by a school or a teacher or a parent. Well, you were learning that thing, whether it's skydiving or carpentry or how to play cards or anything. You have knowledge, but it's not just facts, right? But it's how to use those facts. And you learn skills and procedures and techniques. But you also learn ways of knowing and ways of doing and being, habits of mind, how to be a doctor, how to be a carpenter, how to be a plumber, how to be a historian. How do these people think? So with that in mind, James G., back at the turn of the century, 2003, a little weird calling it the turn of the century, wrote a foundational book, What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. Successful video games incorporate known principles of effective learning, he argued, in order to get players to learn them. It's a matter of life or death for the game. They have to be able to get players to learn how to play, or players won't want the game. So active learning and discipline learning and risk taking and practice and situated learning, all these aspects of learning that lead to sort of true and deep discipline learning, you can find them in these games. They're not teaching you how to do those academic disciplines, they're teaching you how to play them, but we can learn from that. So Fortnite and Destiny and The Sims and Oregon Trail and all these places. So G was saying that, if we learned the principles of good education that video games have, then we could design experiences perhaps that engage people more in the necessary learning, the necessary immersion into a topic. And so the idea would be, building off that, that if you could take on real world roles to learn about real world practices through education, that would be really helpful. And games might be one way to do that. Okay, so that's a whirlwind intro to games and learning. Now let's think for a moment about history, capital history, this thing, this practice of mind, really, that history teachers are trying to teach to students. First, let's make sure we have a broad enough definition. Though the word may not have reached all historians or history educators, history is increasingly understood as what I might call the curated representation of the past. And it's increasingly understood that a historian is anyone who selects from evidence of the past to present a vision of the past in any medium. So what I mean there by curated is we don't have access to all of the past or all of the stuff from the past. We don't have all the evidence from the past. So we're selecting evidence from the past, but we're also selecting what topics we want to talk about when we're doing history. So it's a selected representation of the past. Anyways, it can be done in any medium. So you do history, and I do history, and my students do history. It's a pretty basic human need to present the past selectively and understand our place in it. And that's really important. History's done a great deal, probably mostly outside the secondary classroom and outside the academies of colleges and professional historians. So here's a variety of histories I've put pictures up for. Musical histories, toy histories, book histories, social media histories, and of course board game and video game histories. All of them based on selecting evidence about the past and representing it to us in the present. So this is a pretty reasonable way to think about history. Think about it. Why would history even be valued if it only came from teachers and had no existence outside the class? So many kids end up not liking the history their teachers deliver. This pains us. Why would we all be so engrossed in history, in meaningful representations of the past, if it only existed in academic texts and books? So, of course, by this reasonable standard, history games are history. All right, let's take a moment and define historical games really quickly. There's two definitions floating around. And we don't have to pick one or the other, but it's nice to, I think, know about them. The broader definition is that history games are games that represent the past or are connected to historical topics and discussions. So any game that's raising historical topics and discussions, that's a history game. The definition which I tend to work with more is a little more narrow, is that games that begin at an identifiable point in the past and that setting affects their gameplay. Those are the ones we could call historical games. Let's focus on the narrower definition at the moment because I think it fits more easily with the work I do as an educator and a game studies scholar, but both are fine. And I've given you some examples. These are games that you may have encountered over the weekend. Most of them are the narrower definition of history, but not all of them for sure, or of history games. Okay, game histories. Nothing fancy here, just reminding us all that history is a selective interpretation of the past. So when a game presents the past, it is a history. Okay, so game histories surely don't present the past as the text histories we're all familiar with in textbooks and written histories. So they're not the same, but let's not assume that text is the only way or even the proper way to represent the past. Some of us just say that it's the preferred method because text has been with us for such a long time, the 6th millennium BCE, right? And text accounts of the past are at least 4,400 years old or so. So text is what we're most familiar with when we took classes labeled history classes. Now, I love text very much. I was counting the other day, and I've written pretty close to 500,000 published words in the last 25 years. Text is great. I love text. And text does have some strengths when it comes to representing ideas, whether about the past or anything else. But this is important. Games will not represent the past in the same way text does. And games have their own strength. Most of all, historical games provide players with a level of agency that, if not greater than static text, I happen to think it is greater, is at least quite different from static text. The agency in the story, the game story, or better, the history world, generally allows the player to make choices and experience some agency, which is just an ability to make decisions. And those decisions they make affect the overall story that the game and the game player create. So that agency in systems is something that I think is very critical. And so it's been one of my goals to promote and leverage that understanding for the education of history students, games' ability to work with agency and present agency. And perhaps also to enrich people playing games just as history fans too. So games give us agency in the history world, or the story world. To put more of a point on it, they present the past as something I call historical problem spaces. So games present the past as historical problem spaces. What's that mean? Well, think about the history you've encountered in text and picture and film. There's various actors doing all sorts of things. If a history teacher's on their game, pun intended, they will try to ensure you have considered multiple viewpoints, multiple agents and choices. Teaching history with video games is a bit different than this because the medium is different. And it's probably a good time for me to mention that I don't think all history education should take place through gameplay and analysis. But I definitely think it's a powerful tool to employ sometimes in teaching. Okay, so the game medium is different. Think about a historical game. Any of the ones available to play here this weekend will work perfectly. Pentiment, Kingdom Come, Assassin's Creed, Valiant Hearts. So these games are going to present the past in a particular way. And for those who have played games about worlds, whether it's Mario or Pokemon or Zelda or Fortnite or Destiny or Minecraft, maybe a little less so in Minecraft if you're just building. If you've played those things, you know that you play as a character who is in a world trying to solve goals. So there's nothing too complicated there. Here's the most up-to-date diagram I use to teach this, but hopefully it will illuminate and not overwhelm a simple point. A game is about a particular player agent's problem that they have to solve in the world that they're in. And so a historical game is about a historical player agent's problem in a historical situation that they have to solve. So the assassins of the Creed, Andreas and his Bavarian village in Pentiment, Nazi resistance in Berlin, Walt, the dog Walt, how fantastic, on the battlefields and villages of World War I. The immortal ruler of a civilization state through 6,000 years of history, a Bohemian blacksmith, all are agents in a world space trying to solve problems. So these game histories are told through them and their problem spaces, and players experience them in a form of a narrative and mechanical historical problem space. And that is something quite different, I think, from reading a text account of actors and their choices. Well, if games are very good for exploring agency in world systems, if they have these historical problem spaces that we can experience, can't we just let the students loose on the games and then have the games do our history teaching? Play a game, learn about a particular agent and problem space in history? Well, no. Why? Well, first of all, education, at least good history education, is about expanding habits of mind and fostering methods of inquiry and analysis. The patently incorrect idea that education is just pouring information into a student's head, as I mentioned, has been criticized for literally thousands of years. So this very idea of, okay, here's a game, play it, learn from it, and achieve history education, that's very problematic. Because this conception still leaves the student as the empty vessel, and the educator, now the educator's a game in this model instead of a teacher, is what the old cliche calls the sage on the stage, the master, the authority of all information. Education for many, I hope it's for most, but maybe not, has moved away from this sage on the stage to this idea of guide on the side, to use another cliche. Educators facilitate, they foster and encourage learning, but students do the learning. But guide on the side as a model for teaching still requires the guide, someone to encourage, or require, if you will, the analysis. I've said this on a number of occasions, but I don't think I came up with it first. Education, not least of all formal education, is very much the process of getting students to slow down and consider carefully that thing that they'd rather not slow down and consider carefully. Whether a primary source or a textbook, a lecture, cinema, a work of art, a poem, or in this case, a historical game, We as history educators need to encourage and facilitate our students slowing down and considering when they play historical games in class. So remove the educator and it becomes a question whether students will have the sort of analytical experience we hope for. Sure, they will learn, but maybe not the skills and insights and evidence that we hoped they would learn. Research on what game players take away from playing history games is growing, fortunately. And of course, players learn when they play games. If by learn we mean take away new ways of knowing and being, new understandings and new skills. We're always learning, everywhere. But student players are learning it most incidentally and informally through games, if they're not guided by a teacher. And they're often not learning what we'd like. Game developer Soren Johnson gave a talk recently at the Game Developers Conference, pointing out all the ways that game developer intentions could still end up with players taking the wrong messages, and how implications that the game developers hope to make with their games not infrequently produced opposite understandings. They went for message A, and the player got message X. There's any number of occasions when a game player took a very different message from designer intent. Soren gives examples, the serious game Sweatshop and the nuclear Armageddon war game DEFCON. So players may not pick up the messages that the designers are hoping for. But even when they do pick up some legitimate history education, the research also seems to suggest that if it's played unreflectively, players learn at most a few facts about the historical world, especially elements of material culture. So, oh look, Greek warriors used spears and their temples had different kinds of columns. That is historical information, but it's not particularly deep historical information. The goal of history education, or the goals, go far beyond picking up a few discrete facts. Plus, using gameplay and analysis is a very time and hardware intensive approach if all you're going to do is just learn a couple of facts about the past. But some of that research points to something else that I think is helpful that we can build on. The deepest historical reasoning in connection with a game seems to happen, I mean, as far as we can tell anything about people's thoughts, when a player is writing and talking about the game. And history is happening then, whether it's through forum discussions or Reddit or after action reports. This is where the deepest historical understandings come from. And I would suggest it comes from those areas because the player is taking the time to reflect and analyze the experience. And that reflective analysis is what we should be going for when we use video games in history education. Guided reflected analysis. So it's really important to remember that the educator's presence at many points in the learning process is critical for using games to develop historical understandings and historical skills. So, to achieve all this in the class, we have to insist on purposeful play. Playing with the intent of observing and noting. So kind of like close reading with a text that you're trying to study, but it's with a game instead of a text. And we have to use that observation and notes for critical analysis. By encouraging students and teachers, the way that we get them to apply this critical analysis is by encouraging students and teaching students to approach games with a critical eye, like game histories. By encouraging purposeful play and close analysis of games as historical problem spaces. By reflecting on the messages these games present and combining that reflection with critical evidence analysis. By emphasizing these are entertainment media produced in situations that are usually not focused solely on faithful reproduction of historical sources. These are the understandings and the tasks that we hope our students can engage in. I want my students to be able to take any modern medium, any element of material culture, of the kind that they see all around them, and detect that messages are being presented by these media. And they can observe them and decode them and critique them. I want to empower my students that way. So let me walk you through some of the points I'd hope a student might consider when looking at a game history, when decoding and analyzing it. First, I would stress to my students that historical video games are almost never made for formal education purposes. That's actually a shocker for many of my students. They kind of just assume naturally that if I'm using it in a class, it must have been made for education. It wasn't too long ago, I mean, the early 2000s, that the term educational was considered bad luck for a commercial game because it implied a game that was not fun to play. These games were made by game developers for the reasons people make games: to entertain and delight, to communicate and move, to make a living. That's why most of them are done today. So these historical games implicitly and explicitly claim connections to the past. At the most basic level, any game given a historical setting and topic draws an implicit connection to the historical past. Here's why. Consider this. When a designer designs a game, they can choose to make it about a historical topic or not. Scrabble and Tetris on the one hand versus Assassin's Creed and Civilization. By choosing to connect to a historical world with place names, visuals, symbols, and rules, the designers are claiming implicitly that the game is a historical game. Otherwise, it would be Scrabble or Tetris and not Assassin's Creed or Civilization. And indeed, designers who choose historical games not infrequently do so because, what do you know, surprise, they're interested in that history. And they take advantage of players' general historical knowledge to enrich the content of their game. This is another insight from developer Soren Johnson, and I highly recommend you check out his podcasts and notes, designer notes, if you're interested in getting more of a developer's perspective. Beyond the implicit claims, however, right? This is a game about history because of the labels and the symbols and stuff. Many game designers and publishers make explicit claims connecting their game to history, connecting it to the historical record. It's a good idea, though, to remember that developers and marketing teams quite often don't communicate much. So it's not really the case that these explicit claims are necessarily right from the developers, but they are coming from the agencies and institutions that are producing the games. All right. If you go to the Steam page for these games, there are blurbs there that give you some indication of explicit claims that are being made. So The Guild 3 is a unique mixture of economic simulation, strategy game, historical life simulation, and role-playing game in real-time 3D with atmospheric voice recording and medieval soundtrack. Quote, Civilization 6 is the newest installment in the award-winning Civilization franchise. Expand your empire, advance your culture, and go head-to-head against history's greatest leaders. Will your civilization stand the test of time? Rule your nation, quote unquote, through the centuries. I'm sorry, quote, rule your nation through the centuries with unparalleled freedom, depth, and historical accuracy. The Europa Universalis 4 website. And they go on. These games make some claim to be connected to the real world past in some historically accurate ways. They're using words and choices that are making a claim that they're connected to history. Now let's leave aside the problem about what historical accuracy even means, but they are suggesting play this and you'll get at least some legitimate history. But the connection between a historical record and a game is usually pretty flexible. Even when a historical setting is used, even when faithfulness to the historical evidence is the guide, there's often a tension between following the historical evidence and record and making the best game design decisions. The best game design decisions are based around the goal of planning fun and engagement. Historical accuracy concerns are hopefully based on careful critical sifting and gathering and analysis of evidence. So the two don't always fit. So let's think a moment about commercial history video games designed to entertain. These games generally have several features, common to the medium of commercial games as a whole, but maybe stretching historical records. The first feature is player agent empowerment. As the quotations I mentioned above suggest, these games are about empowering the player, providing them the opportunity to engage in a power fantasy and match the achievements of those in the past, or even exceed those of the past. This often translates into games where the player's power tends to exceed the historical and physiological limitations humans have and had. Think all the climbing and stealth and assassin abilities of an Assassin's Creed agent. It goes beyond what humans can do most of the time. Interesting choices, as Sid Meier famously said it, are also at the heart of a good game. No, interesting choices alone. Oh, I'm sorry, I misread that. If there aren't any interesting choices, it's not really a good game. So this translates into games where the mundane aspects of history, however critical, are often ignored. Peasant agriculture, for example, was the practice of 90% of the populations in ancient worlds. But this is almost completely neglected in games like Civilization and Europa Universalis and the Total War series. The gritty accounting details of managing a railroad are generally missing from rail simulations. Making laws in video game government don't take as long or require as many bureaucratic steps. This is all part of focusing on interesting choices for engaging gameplay. Related to this, there's some streamlining, simplifying complex processes and facets of the past to make for more easily understandable games and more easily learnable gameplay. Converting the health of soldiers into hit points, calculating the experience of a player agent in terms of levels, treating all nutritional requirements of humans as simple all-purpose food, expressing diplomatic relationships as positive or negative numbers. These are all examples of simplification. Also, you might have noticed they're often about turning world features into numbers. So taking together, these demands of engaging gameplay can, if the designer wishes, make the video game history a potentially very simplistic and stylized representation of the evidence. That's okay, but it's definitely something you want your history students to be aware of and assess in a game they purposefully play. And again, on top of designers' goals to create engaging gameplay, let's think again about the historical problem space framework. Game histories are shaped in that they create a historical problem space framework that's based on their understandings of the past. So a game history, when a designer attempts to model the past, the parts of the game are going to function according to that designer's understanding of the past. This isn't, a particularly deep revelation, but it's important. So a classic example of this comes from Will Wright's seminal city building game, SimCity. In the early SimCities, I honestly don't know if it continues to work this way, raising taxes increased the unhappiness of city inhabitants. Now, of course, when we get down to it, the proposition that higher taxes results in higher happiness is far more of a political or philosophical belief than a verifiable fact about human cities. But it made sense to Will Wright or to whoever coded that feature into the game. Or, and this is an intriguing thought that I continue to explore in my work and continue to follow Soren Johnson for, it can be sometimes that the hardware limitations for a game system required the developers to code things to work in a certain way. Let me give you some more examples that designers are presenting their understandings of the past in games. Civilization continues to emphasize designer understandings that geography is a big factor in a civilization's success. And success is something that's primarily measured in quantitative terms for one kind of domination or another, military or cultural or religious. I wrote an essay a while ago on the Roman city building game called Civ City Rome, and it had a happiness level that was essentially a material comfort level. And that happiness level determined the success of the simulation. In other words, bread and circuses, giving the people the stuff they want, will make them happy. The popular Total War series suggests that morale is a critical part of battles because soldiers don't fight until they die, not always anyways, but they fight until their morale dips too low and then they flee in fear. And it's difficult to put into words what the designers of Assassin's Creed understand as history because so much of it is amazingly visual, right? These 3D visual historical text boxes. They're kind of better seen and navigated than described in the text, or described in text. So please remember, it's important to note that these features don't really necessarily conflict with historical evidence. They're not unhistorical thinking. My point is simply that they reflect the designer's understandings of the past. If a designer, for example, didn't think morale was important, they wouldn't have made it critical in Total War. Presumably, Sid Meier would not have made geography so important in Civ games unless he thought it was a reasonable take on geography and history. These are just two examples of what happen to be generally defensible models of the past. So all I'm saying here really is, again, that game developers who make historical games are making history. So that's what we end up with, all manner of game histories, united by their focus on simulating the problem space of a person or people in the past, the goal-oriented pursuit of people in the past. Part of the history learning through purposeful play and analysis requires considering the way the historical record can be shaped by a game problem space. Here's some big ways that making the world into a historical problem space shapes the history. The player agent, the character you're playing as, they tend to be presented as rational goal seekers. They know what they want to achieve it, and to some extent, they have an idea how to achieve it. Historically, of course, agents in the world, we ourselves, we may be anything but conscious, rational goal seekers from one moment to the next. Another point, though it's not always the case, player agents in history games tend to be more powerful and have access to more information than their historical counterparts. Similarly, game history tends to be what we call teleological in focus. It tends to be goal focused. It's focused on the ends. The player agent tends, as I've suggested, to have an idea about what the goal is for the whole game, and generally how to reach it. And accordingly, a player agent, particularly in strategy games, can make choices and trade-offs for a goal that might take years or decades or centuries of game time to arrive. Games in Civilization offer excellent examples. The most successful players often consciously make choices early in the game about what technology to research, for example, to position themselves for a victory several hundred game turns, which is like thousands of game years later. So another thing is that the action choices available to the player agents are necessarily limited by the designed game world goals and elements. Historical agents, real world agents, have spaces, resources, agents, tools, and consequently choices that are simply beyond what a history game player agent has. So in the real world, we have these opportunities and possibilities and options that just aren't going to all be in a game. I used to feel this way when I was playing the old Infocom games back in the 80s. I was never very good at solving the puzzles because I wasn't very good at figuring out what the designer thought the puzzle was. It's if they have a game where you have to find the rope ladder to climb up something, it's not going to work to go somewhere to a store, buy a ladder, put it on the wall to be able to crawl up it, because that option's not available in the game. Anyways, so the world generally has many more possibilities for choices than the game world. And in a game world, options are limited to a finite set, shaped by the logic and historical understanding and design goals of the developers. Another big one in historical problem space approach, non-player agents are often portrayed instrumentally and without significant agency. Often, though not always, the player agent focused on by a game is a powerful decision maker, historically dominant, somebody from the ruling groups, as opposed to marginalized. Both issues involving agents can perpetuate a bias that the field still labors under of history, focusing on the powerful individual rather than the many or the marginalized. And this is a really important one to remember when you're educating younger people, that games tend to, more often than not, emphasize the powerful versus the powerless and take the non-player characters in the game and represent them as less able to make decisions. But that weakness can be turned on its head. For example, there's a Seven Cities of Gold 1993 remake, and sometimes in an imperialism unit, I'll have my students research or play that only so they can pick at it and critique in what ways is this emphasizing a single viewpoint, that of a colonizer? In what ways is it promoting and glorifying that? In what ways is it maybe not always glorifying that? So you can certainly use that for a critique, but it's important for students to be aware of the general focus on the powerful. Worth noting, however, that games from smaller independent designers have recently made significant strides in centering on historically less powerful agents. When Rivers Were Trails, Through the Darkest of Times, A Tentat 1942, A Plague Tale Innocence, for example. These are all games, and there are others that are focusing on historically less powerful people making choices and achieving things. For me, then, these are some of the reasons I like to use these games together with kids and work on purposeful play. Critical analysis of modern media, looking at problem spaces and agency and systems, and interactivity focusing on choices and possibilities. I'm not really going to get into the logistics of doing this with students in classes. I've written a lot on this. You can find it all over the place. I'm just going to say two things. One, I'm always learning through my students in classes. And two, I have discovered over time how incredibly meaningful and important it can be for students to make their own games. And that's what I'd like to talk about with you next, how my students make their own historical games as part of their history studies. All right. So the two main ways where my students get to work on this are in interactive texts using Twine, so like a choose your own adventure. One could use Inkle now too, and board game design. Why? Because anyone who's ever tried to design a historical game that actually speaks to and about the past knows one thing for sure. It's hard. The means to approach it is why it's so difficult. For one has to take historical evidence, historical details, and not just pass them on, but use them to craft a historical problem space. And that's often very hard, for it requires a designer to get at the core agencies of the chosen player agent and the edges of possibility. What could this historical agent do? What were they trying to do? How did the world enable and constrain them in their goals? That requires some hefty historical knowledge, and that requires research. And these are things that I want my students to experience. If it's that challenging for me to design a historical game for anyone, what a great challenge for students to be engaged in. What a great way to work on creativity and design thinking and historical research. All right, so in all of this, it's really important to remember with my students when we're gaming the past that there's a critical perspective that needs to be taken. Historical habits of mind, I want them to be able to think like historians. I want them to be able to use evidence. I want them to at least attempt to be open-minded and objective in their analyses. I want them to be able to make arguments that are strong and well-reasoned and based on close observations. So that's critical. It's also critical to observe closely and make lots and lots of notes when you're playing these games. Without the reflection, without the annotation, there's not going to be as much learning from games. It's going to be more informal learning. It's important to corroborate. Look at different sources as you're putting together your arguments, or look at different sources as you're putting together your games. And most of all, talk about it. I wrote an essay about 13 years ago called "The Unexamined Game is Not Worth Playing." And in it, I suggested that any game can be useful for history education if it gets students talking about the past. I had a student once write a critique of a French Revolution game. No, it was a Louis the 14th game. And they wrote this wonderful essay that said that it wasn't useful for education, that the game was historically not very accurate and therefore not so good. um, it got an A. I handed it back to the student. I said, by arguing that that game wasn't useful for historical education, you actually proved that it was very useful for historical education. It's the debrief. It's the talking about it. It's the criticism. These are the things that are important. So if it's going to be a game used in a history class, the unexamined game is not worth playing. All right, so there we go. Gaming the past, the powers and promise of games in history classes. Here's how you can reach me. I always love being able to talk about these things. So please feel free to reach out to me on social media or send me an email. You've got it there. And if there's anything you want to do that I can help you with history and games, I'll be delighted for that. Thank you, folks, and hoping in a couple of weeks after you've seen this that we're going to have, excuse me, some good conversation.